welcome to this lesson for Advanced Higher Biology. This is our first section for Unit 2, the Organisms and Evolution unit, and we are beginning this unit with having a little look at some of the field techniques that biologists should be expected to know. And this lesson in particular is going to focus on the health and safety aspects of what fieldwork might actually look like. So obviously you should be aware from our previous lessons about health and safety in the lab. This lesson is going to focus on health and safety when you're out and about, and then we will move on to have a wee look at some specific fieldwork techniques, starting off with how we would carry out sampling of organisms. So for today, what we're expecting you to be able to understand is how to plan and carry out fieldwork safely. You will need to be able to state some of the hazards and risks associated with fieldwork, identify methods of reducing the risks in fieldwork, and explain why working in the field may have a greater range of hazards than working in the laboratory. So to start off thinking about what we mean by fieldwork. Now, fieldwork is really any kind of practical work that is carried out by a researcher outside of a laboratory. And that means that, generally speaking, you are observing rather than controlling your environment, and that will naturally add additional complexities to identifying your hazards and managing your risk. So when we consider the risks and hazards that may occur in a laboratory setting, obviously there are fewer of those as we are able to control more of the environment and the surroundings around us. With fieldwork, it's far more unpredictable, and you are more at the mercy of the environment around you. Now, just before we move on any further, just have a wee think about what we mean by the terms hazard and what we mean by the term risk. Obviously, they're ever so slightly different, and it's important to be aware of the differences between them. So a hazard is anything that has the potential to cause harm. So in this example, our hazard is our shark in the water, so that's obviously a hazard. The risk is the likelihood of that hazard causing you harm. So if you were to remain on the beach, for example, then you are incredibly low risk. It's highly unlikely the shark is going to come out of the water and attack you. If you're to go into the water, however, that's going to increase your risk. So we can obviously do things to manage the risk, and we may or may not be able to do things to manage the hazards or the presence of hazards. So when it comes to the environment, obviously you could choose to go to a beach or an area of the world where there are no sharks at all. That would be eliminating that hazard from your environment. If that wasn't your option, then you can consider how can you manage the risks. What can we do in order to avoid the likelihood of that hazard causing harm? So when we carry out a risk assessment, what we're carrying out is looking at the likelihood of those hazards causing any harm and what we can do to mitigate that and prevent it from happening. Now, when it comes to fieldwork, we focus hazards around four main categories. There is the weather, the terrain, the isolation, and the contact with harmful organisms or potentially harmful organisms. So we're going to have a quick look at each of these in turn and consider how they may present a hazard, the risks that we may have to avoid when we're carrying out specific fieldwork. So to begin with, thinking about terrain, and that's really just referring to the type of ground where the fieldwork is going to be conducted. So obviously assessing that before you set out is fairly essential, and we also need to consider weather when we're looking at that as well. Ice, mud, water, mountains, cliffs, trees, any of those may present some kind of hazard. And you need to think about reasonable precautions to avoid the risks from these hazards, such as using harnesses, using safety gear, and of course making sure you've got appropriate footwear. That should all be considered. We also naturally have to consider weather, and it's important, particularly for us Scottish people, to think about areas which may have very sunny weather. Obviously sunburn is actually and dehydration and sunstroke are a significant risk depending on the environment that you're in. There are also some areas that may become very hazardous very quickly. Weather is very unpredictable and may change. So we need to be giving consideration to risks from all weather types, so sun exposure, the cold, the wet, windy weather, and forecasts should ideally be consulted before leaving. Wearing weather appropriate clothing, etc. should all be mitigated into your risk assessment. Now, often fieldwork takes place in isolated areas, particularly when we're examining the environment. We tend to go into areas which may not be affected or may not be very close to human habitation, and as a result it could be quite an isolated area. That may present a particular hazard in the event of injury or illness. So even a relatively simple injury could have significant impact if you're working on your own in the field and medical help or evacuation is difficult or impossible. So evacuation procedures may need to be considered along with details of an emergency contact. Many environments where you would be expected to work out on your own or working in isolation at any point would normally have some kind of lone working procedure whereby you would be expected to report in to another colleague or someone else. Usually there's some kind of buddy system whereby you would report in to somebody and let them know where you were going and the time you're expected back home, and you should also be getting in contact with them to let them know that you've arrived safely home. And if you haven't, they'll be the people getting in touch with the emergency services to find out where you are. So those sorts of mitigations should be considered with a risk assessment in terms of the isolation of the fieldwork that you might be doing. Finally, we need to have a think about any potential contact with harmful organisms. So this is obviously going to be very environmentally dependent. Different environments and different ecosystems will contain very many different species. And consequently, you're going to have to be considering what is native to that area and what else may be around in the area that you are carrying out your fieldwork in. So alongside whatever organism it is that you are studying, there will be many organisms which may have a harmful impact. Now, these could range from incredibly serious to relatively minor, and that will depend very much on the type of organism, but also on the individual who is carrying out the fieldwork. So obviously there are some minor injuries that may occur, nettle stings, midgie bites, things along those lines. Some people may have anaphylactic reactions to any of these, however, and they should be aware of that and potentially carrying an EpiPen, thinking of things like bee stings, etc. Obviously you've got your more severe injury that might be caused. There's spider bites, snake bites, jellyfish, any large mammals that may be around. There could be many things that could cause you harm. So in terms of their risk assessment, you need to be considering the likelihoods of encountering any of these, the significance of any harm that may be done by them, how you may be best avoiding them, and what you may have to do should you encounter one of these organisms. If you know, for example, you're going to be in an area where there's a common venomous snake, you may have to have some anti-venom with you, and you may be in areas where you cannot work in any isolation because of the risks posed by the organisms around you. So one of the things that you would need to consider in your risk assessment is which types of organisms you may come across, the potential for harm, and how you can manage and mitigate those particular risks. So from that, you should be able to state our main areas of hazard being terrain, weather, isolation, and potentially dangerous organisms or harmful organisms. Being able to identify specific methods of reducing those risks when you're considering them, and considering the fact that working in the field is going to have a greater range of hazards than working in the lab, really because you can't control the environment around you in the same way as you can when you're working indoors. You're more at risk of general changes. Now, as ever, if you have any questions, please do get in touch, either by leaving a comment, popping onto the website, or sending an email.